Remember that vendor that promised you the world, but then nothing ever came of it? You wasted a ton of time, a ton of money, and at the end you had nothing to show for it? In this video, we're going to talk about how to avoid that. My name's Isaac Hicks, founder and CEO of Autonomy, and I've spent the last 6 years doing artificial intelligence builds for the middle market. In that time, I've driven over $50 million in wasted spend back to the bottom line. Now, this is part 3 of a 3-part series on how to make sure your artificial intelligence investment actually generates a return in your business. If you haven't seen part 1 and part 2, in those we go over where the best places to apply AI are and whether you should buy it, build it, or configure it. All right, so one thing to understand about the AI space is it's very different than any other space you have looked at vendors in before. And there are a couple of different reasons for that. The first reason is because there is so much noise in the AI space, since it's such a nascent field as far as being a provider of AI is concerned, there is a lot of noise. And in that noise, the dynamic exists that the AI products and the AI services that get the most recognition are those that have the best marketing and not necessarily those that are actually the best products. And in general, you kind of actually see the opposite, where the products and services that are extremely well marketed are the ones that tend to actually not work out and have problems. There are ones that are very big that do work very well, but there typically are superior options that are not as well marketed. So the best marketed option is not necessarily the highest quality. The biggest example of this I can think of is that if you look at the results of testing of Gemini and Anthropic models over the past 3 to 6 months, they blow ChatGPT out of the water in multiple instances. Yet ChatGPT remains amongst the biggest name in that space and holds that authority because they have significantly larger marketing and they have been pushed significantly harder than Gemini and Anthropic have so far. So let's start with what preliminary discussion should feel like. So the biggest indicator of whether or not you're working with a quality vendor is going to be the amount of and the depth of questions that they ask you before they get to the point of trying to assess whether their product or service is going to work for you. So how big the front half of the conversation is that is primarily around your problem, that is a very strong indicator of whether or not you're working with a real pro. So if we take, for example, a call answering service where they are going to provide an automated AI voice agent that is able to answer calls and then automatically set appointments on your calendar based on the calls that come in. An example of what a company that is going to work out would do is, as you are describing exactly what you're doing, they would be asking very thoroughly, okay, exactly when do people call you? What kinds of things are they talking about? Do you have an existing script for your existing callers? What are the pat responses for different objections that you may face while you're attempting to schedule? How long do you expect the delay time to be between when the person on the other end of the phone has stopped talking and the person on our end of the phone is beginning to talk? How do you want to handle voice inflection? You see, there's a lot of details that go into a solution like that a bad vendor would simply say, you would approach and say, I would like an automated call answering system. And they would say, we have an automated call answering system, works 24 hours a day, costs 5 times less than hiring people in the Philippines to do it. How can we get started? Let's talk about, you want a test drive? Let's get you in a test drive, right? Very, very different dynamic. Now, just as a word of caution in this, I want to tell the story of a company called Air AI. So if you haven't heard of Air AI, you can look them up, but they went the route of attempting to just get as many users as possible, get as much investment as possible, get as much growth as possible, and did not really pay attention to the product quality as they were doing that. And because of that, they ended up really screwing over a very large audience. It was a very big problem. They ended up getting sued for a substantial amount of money. So you really need to pay attention here at the beginning. And if you get that indicator that they're just trying to sell you quick, you got to move on to the next company. So once you've done your preliminary discussions, the next step is going to be the proposal and negotiation process. If you're looking at products or you're doing something that's very simple, you wouldn't expect this to really be that big of an issue. But if you are doing something that requires multiple pieces, is a little bit larger, then you're really going to want to pay attention to how the proposal stage is handled. Now, the number one thing to take a look at is going to be the depth that the proposal goes into in explaining the solution. Now, a very sparse proposal, something that seems very short relative to the amount of money that you are looking at spending or the amount of time that you're looking at spending, this is something that should cause some concern. Another thing to look at is whether or not they only denote how many hours are going to be spent or the amount of time that is going to be spent without really explaining the way that the system is going to function. A proper proposal is going to be written in a way that even if you aren't very technical, you're going to be able to read through what is going on in the proposal and at least get an understanding of what this system is going to look like, what systems are going to interact with it, and all of the major aspects of the design and clarification of the design should be denoted in the proposal. Now, in the case of custom project proposals, you're going to expect this to be a significantly lengthier document, whereas in the case of configuration-based operations, you would expect this to be probably more of a bullet point style format. And then, of course, whenever it comes to product-based operations, if you're looking at products that are below around $500 a month in cost, then you're probably not going to have a formal agreement like this. But once you get into the 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 range, that's when you're going to start looking at having pretty specific enterprise level paperwork that is going to come along with that project agreement. Now, when it comes to pricing, you really want to look at whether or not the company is willing to work on a fixed fee basis rather than a retainer basis. If they're willing to work on a fixed fee basis, that means that they've done it before, they have a lot of experience, and they're confident in their ability to get you to the end result and are willing to eat the cost if there are unknown unknowns because they are confident enough in their understanding of the situation. If a company insists on sticking with hours plus overages, then that overages are being used as a hedge against scope creep, and there is potential to get into a dynamic where you're continuing to ask for more and more, and they're just saying yes and then charging you an accelerated overage rate, especially when you look at consulting companies that are doing custom development work, and especially as you get towards the higher end work, that is something to be very careful of, and you can really nip a lot of problems in the bud if you look at whether they will do a fixed cost rather than a per hour cost. Next thing is you would expect that the change control and the procedure around scope control is going to be very strong. If they do not have a strong procedure around scope control, or their procedure is simply, yeah, if you ask us to do more, we can discuss it and we'll add more hours, you want to avoid that. You always want to go with organizations that are willing to amend the project and go through a more formal project control procedure whenever unknown unknowns pop up that are going to actually derail the project. And the reason for that is because you do not want an AI vendor that is going to tell you that everything's okay and they can just fold different things in, you know. Personally, we will fold in very, very small things like, oh, I wish this color was different, or oh, it would be nice if, you know, this thing, something that takes 15 minutes of work. But if they're willing to do large changes, massive things, and then keep it under the same proposal and not really insist on a formal project change, then that's going to be a problem. And another thing to note here is you want the people who are going to push for that formal project change. If you are looking for somebody who can be very amenable and kind of flexible to what may be a changing condition, you need to go back to the drawing board and really understand what a solution would look like for that problem so that you can seek out a project that is going to fully define that problem. Again, this isn't something that you really run into in products. If you have found a product that actually fits your use case, a lot of this discussion is irrelevant. But when you're looking at hiring people to build something, whether that is building a configuration or building a product from scratch, these things are very important. And lastly, we have our SLAs, our service level agreements. These should be explicitly written out, and used as part of the negotiation. There should be specifications around the amount of time that can be spent on support, what after go live support looks like whenever you actually get the project done and you're ready to go. There should be expectations around not only how quickly they will respond to you whenever you reach out, but how quickly you will respond to them when they reach out to you. A big qualifier of a pro, of somebody who really knows what they're doing, is they will know that any project that they're building for you has the requirement that you deliver back things that they need from you on time in order to get the job done. That line in the agreement, that term, that is going to be a specific indicator of the fact that they have been doing this long enough to have that occur. All right, so after proposal and negotiation, if you are doing something that is a custom build project or some kind of configuration project, the next thing that is going to occur is going to be the project itself. So from a planning and organization perspective, you should expect from a team that's going to deliver that they will have a clearly defined updating live project dashboard that their team will be using internally in order to organize the tasks and responsibilities of those who are going to be working on getting the job done. And if somebody is unwilling to share internal progress with you, they're unwilling to kind of share the same tracker that they're using internally with you for your view as a fellow executive, that is something that should give you pause. I know at Autonomy what we do is we provide a live link so that people can come in and view at any time, so that they don't even have to bother us with asking about progress. They can just see the progress live at any point throughout their day. If you're going to have any kind of user interface, any kind of web portal or something like that, that you would expect people internal to your company to work through, then the very first thing that should occur is an understanding of exactly what that UI UX is going to look like. So this would be a mock-up, some kind of shareable medium by which to get a common operating picture of exactly what this tool should look like when it is complete. And then the API integrations, any kind of backend configurations and integrations, all of that will happen in parallel or after this occurs, but this should be one of the very first things. If the team that you're working with does not have any front-facing deliverables, that is something that is going to be a cause for concern. If they continue to say, oh, we're just working on the back end, we don't really have anything to show you besides a bunch of code, you probably don't want to see all that code. If that's what they say, tell them you do want to see that code, and I think you would be surprised at how much or how little code is really there. Now, another thing when it comes to this is even if you're doing a middleware type of configuration where there isn't going to be a user front end, there should at least be some kind of documented flow chart, some kind of document, something that defines the actual logic and conditions under which the tool is expected to operate. So that should be one of the very first things that occurs. Then after that, there will be back-end configurations that will go on for some time. There may be some iteration if you are building iteration into your project plan. And then, of course, at the end, there will be user testing, a round of revisions, maybe 2 rounds of revisions, and then go live. Now, as far as the actual meeting cadence is concerned, when you're going to meet with this team, typically this is going to look like weekly or bi-weekly check-ins with the core stakeholder team inside of your organization. This typically looks like having 2 or 3 people who are really in charge of this project internally, and then they are working with the vendor team in order to get the project done. Of course, the larger the project is, the more custom it is, the more in the weeds and in the details this is going to be. But in general, you would expect 1 30-minute call a week, and if the implementation is going to go very quickly, then you might only have 1 or 2 or 3 check-ins before the actual final result is ready for you anyway. And then, of course, any other kinds of ad hoc meetings that you may need to have, they should be available very easily through email. Of course, you will have defined in your SLAs what those response characteristics look like, so all of that should be followed and they should be relatively responsive during that. Now, another thing to look at is how they act when scope changes or when things go wrong. So it should be documented from the beginning. exactly what is going to occur, if scope needs to change, if things go wrong, if there is some kind of change of plans. But in general, the team should be very cooperative, very collaborative, and working with you very closely. If the plan gets derailed, they should be willing to take the lead and kind of manage that process in order to get everybody to an end result that is going to work. They should not begin playing, some kind of blame game or allowing the situation to deteriorate and trying to, kind of make sure that they are positioned in such a way that if the end result was the worst, they would have the least amount of liability. Of course, every organization would attempt to do a little bit of that in the worst case, but you do expect a good, high-quality vendor is going to be more interested in cooperating with you in order to get to an end result, rather than trying to protect themselves in situations where you may disagree. Now, the one thing you want to look at is whether or not they are primarily interested in project success or in their own success. If they're primarily interested in project success, then they are going to do things that may not be in their best interest in order to make sure that the project works. Of course, they're not going to allow you to just tell them whatever, but they are going to be more flexible and they are going to work with you as far as getting things done is concerned. If it is very rigid, if it is very hard, if the happy-go-lucky nature that you experienced prior to the project is no longer there during the project, that is also cause for concern, and you may need to look into that. And then, of course, finally, when would you expect them to push back? How would that occur, and what would that look like? So you do expect a good vendor to protect scope of a project pretty strongly, but you do also expect them to work with you in trying to figure out workarounds and trying to figure out how to make sure functionality that is not necessarily easy to achieve may still be achievable and feasible under the terms of your agreement, or whether or not you need to go into project change control. This should be a very collaborative thing. If they become defensive at all, if they don't really have a procedure for this, or it catches them off guard, that is going to be indicative of a bad vendor. Another thing is if they are willing to create like a parking lot that assumes there will be a V1.5, V2, V3, different iterations of this, and they talk about creating a parking lot for a different scope in the future for that, that is also a very good sign that you're working with a real professional. And then finally, at the point of go live, what you would expect a good vendor to do is to be right there with you, able to respond very quickly to any problems that happen at the point of go live with a gradually fading SLA window. So typically this looks something like within 5 minutes in the first 72 hours, within an hour within the first 5 business days, and then within 1 to 2 business days after that for the support period. There's typically a support period that should be included post go live before you convert immediately into some kind of ongoing support contract. You can negotiate that as part of your SLAs, but in general, you would be looking at a 30 to 60 day post go live support. All right, so that brings us to the end of our 3-part series on how to make sure you actually get an ROI on your AI investments. The reason I wanted to make this video is I've seen a lot of things in my career. I've cleaned up a lot of messes and I've helped a lot of organizations out. And the most common sales motion I see, I begin talking to somebody, they decide they're going to go out, find a product to try to fit their use case, find a team that is going to build something out for them, and then it ends up not working out. They are out 6 to 9 months, they've spent a bunch of money, and then they come back to me after that process and then want to build something together. And I would really just like to prevent people from having to make those mistakes and otherwise just do the planning up front that gets you to where you're trying to get, because AI, it is a truly amazing technology and you really can take your business to just an incredibly different level if you utilize it effectively. But the vast majority of the time, people are not doing it the right way, and it ends up being a big waste of time and a big waste of money. So if you do need any help related to that, if you find yourself in a situation where you are going to be making a purchase in the AI space, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or on email. I'm happy to answer any questions, provide any advice. Even if we don't end up working together, I'd be happy to do that. I've seen what it looks like at the end when a project like this doesn't really work out, and it's not a situation you want to experience, and it's not a situation any of us really want to be a part of.